And because of this existential threat, as the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has put it, he convened this Climate Ambition Summit today precisely to try to move forward this topic. Now, interesting to note that the Secretary General in his office decided not to invite countries or companies, because business leaders were also invited, that they deemed were not making enough of a commitment on climate change. So that means the United States was not present, China was not present, at least the leaders of those countries were not present. That was seen as a bit of a barb at those countries. But instead, Antonio Guterres said he wanted to give a voice to those countries that are first movers, those that are really making a commitment to slash carbon emissions and to help developing countries. That's also important to note, because developing countries here have long complained that they are bearing the brunt of climate change, while richer nations have not paid their fair share in helping them mitigate climate change. That being said, one of the countries that was present at the summit was Scotland, and First Minister Humza was there, and he came out afterwards and he spoke with us about how the UK's decision actually was playing at that summit.
Well, it very firmly takes the UK out of the global consensus. The global consensus is we need to do more to tackle climate change. And the reason why Scotland has been invited for the first time to the UN for the Climate Ambition Summit is because we're showing leadership. So the same day we're showing leadership, the same day the whole world is gathered to talk about what more we can do, we have a UK Prime Minister rolling back on commitments. And
I think that he's not showing leadership.
Not only is he not showing leadership, I think what he's doing is utterly unforgivable. It is something that, frankly, you would see on the fringes, not in the mainstream, in the fringes of politics, not in the mainstream. And what he's done is taken the UK out of that global consensus. I've been speaking to heads of government, I've been talking to heads of nations, and every single one I've spoken to, virtually every single one, has asked me what on earth the Prime Minister is doing. It's frankly an embarrassment.
And what have you answered?
I've answered, look, I'm from Scotland, I'm responsible for what I can do, and I promise you we'll continue to show leadership. We'll just transition away from fossil fuels to renewables, and we'll commit to loss of damages. But we'll do everything we can to get the UK government to U-turn, to change course, because it is simply unforgivable, because our children and future generations will be the ones who will suffer as a result. And the UK has lost a lot of influence over the years, post-Brexit. It's now, I'm afraid, diminished, I think, beyond recognition.
So if you look at what Rishi Sunak has said, he has said that people are struggling with cost of living, and the UK will still be able to meet its climate goals. What's your response to that, rather?
Just as a side, of course, people are struggling with the cost of living crisis because his predecessor completely tanked the economy with a mini budget that meant inflation went up beyond 10%. But let's put that to the side for a moment. He's right, people are suffering the cost of living crisis. So it's incumbent on government to step up and support people. So in Scotland, for example, when it comes to, if you want to buy an electric vehicle, we provide monetary support. When it comes to changing your heating system from a direct emission heating system to a zero emission heating system, we provide funding. We provide funding in order to transition away from oil and gas and towards renewables. So governments have to step up, not step back.
At the same time, it is also going to be difficult to balance in Scotland combating climate change and also helping people with the cost of living, isn't it?
Of course, this is all about difficult choices. Let's not pretend, let's not equivocate. This is going to be difficult. The climate catastrophe deserves difficult choices. We have to make difficult choices. If we don't, what we saw this summer, all of the scenes of devastation across the world, including, of course, here in the United States, it will be worse next year, and worse the year after, and the year after, and the year after. It is more expensive, both to economic cost, but human cost, to do nothing.
I want to come back to your point about the UK's place in the world, because we spoke a little bit earlier to the former US Vice President Al Gore, and he said that he was also befuddled. He doesn't, of course, have any thoughts on UK politics as he's not a citizen, but is befuddled by the decision, and said the following. He said he has spoken to members of the Conservative Party, quote, who have used the phrase utter disgust and contempt, and young people who feel really strong about this. Is that the sentiment in Scotland as well?
They'll feel betrayed. The difference is, at least people in Scotland have a Scottish government that can try to prevent some of the harm that's coming from Westminster. But we can't do all of it. We can't protect them entirely because the full levers are not in our hand. And Al Gore is absolutely right. There is utter disgust, I think, at the UK government's U-turn, the Prime Minister's U-turn in dumping some of these pledges. And I don't even think electorally it's going to work for him either. I think he will absolutely...
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think he's taken a political calculation. He's looked at some number somewhere that's been given to him, said if you go on this issue, it'll help you in the polls. I really don't think it will. I think most people out there see the news, see the pictures, see the devastation, and what they don't want is their world leaders or the heads of government, regardless of politics, to roll back. They want them to step up, and that's what the Scottish Government will do. It's just a shame that the UK Government, as I say, have further diminished their standing in the world by this nonsensical announcement.
Again, Rishi Sunak would make the argument that his constituents in the UK would say we need to bring down the cost of energy at a time where people are really struggling to pay the bills at the end of the month, and that in the meantime, while still meeting 2050 goals, it is important to make sure people can get by.
And look, I agree that people are struggling. So the responsibility for the UK Government is to make sure that they do energy market reform. Why don't they make sure they price renewable energy so that it is, of course, cheaper than electric and gas? Look, on our west coast, we have the United States that have brought in the Inflation Reduction Act. They've shown that they're willing to put money to incentivise to bring that investment in renewable technologies to their country. On our east coast, we have the EU, who's done the Green Deal partnership. And what's the UK done? They've twiddled their thumbs, they've sat in their hands, they've decided that they're not going to do anything. And that's bad for our planet. It's also really bad for the cost of living crisis. Scotland has an abundance of renewable technology. If you've ever been to Scotland, I know you have, it's a very windy place, which is not great for your tourist experience, but it's great for us in terms of renewables. But the UK Government have never priced it properly, and they can do that, and it means cheaper energy bills for everyone in the UK.
So First Minister, just a few days ago, you said that Scotland will transition from Europe's oil and gas capital to be its net zero capital and provide moral leadership on the climate crisis. But can Scotland actually still do that with the Prime Minister's announcement today?
Do you know what? I wish I could give you the absolute straight answer and say definitely. The difficulty is we need to look at what the UK Government have done and whether that impacts us, because many of the levers still exist with the UK Government. The power is in their hands over a number of issues. So I need to look at the detail of that. But what I won't do is I won't step back on my ambition. Our ambition remains actually to be net zero 5 years earlier than the UK in 2045. That remains the ambition. And even if the UK Government put roadblock after roadblock, our job will be just be to find a way to overcome that way.
I understand you'll have to go back and look at the details, but what concrete steps can you take then in Scotland to move forward despite these restrictions that will be coming from the UK?
So I suppose one of the biggest things we can do is put up, as we have agreed to do, £500 million for the just transition from oil and gas to renewables. Because look, ultimately we don't want to leave a single oil and gas worker on the scrap heap. That's not fair, that's not a just transition. So what we have to do is invest. And what I've said to the UK Government is, look, you've extracted billions of pounds to the UK Treasury, hundreds of billions over the decades from oil and gas. Put a fraction of that back in order to help us with a just transition, and that's what I'd urge the Prime Minister to do.
So one of the key debates about the UK's climate ambitions is over Rosebank, which is the largest oil field that is still untapped. Now, with the Prime Minister's announcement, will you push for that to indeed remain untapped?
I'm not at all convinced that Rosebank should be going ahead for quite obvious reasons, I think, particularly the argument around the energy security, when the majority of Rosebank, as you rightly say, is oil, and that oil then gets exported. It doesn't stay in Scotland or indeed the UK. What I would say is, if you want another example of the abdication of political responsibility from the Prime Minister, he came up to Scotland, a week, 2 weeks at most, after the Secretary General of the UN said that July was said to be the hottest month in human history. And unlimited oil and gas extraction is not going to help Scotland, the UK, and most importantly, it certainly isn't going to help the planet.
What message are you taking back from this UN General Assembly, particularly on climate and back to the UK?
Pretty simple message. We all have to do more. We have to do that with pace and urgency. And let's stop overcomplicating the matter. We have to put up the finance in order to transition. We have to make sure that we work with the global south around loss and damages. And we have to phase out oil and gas. It is actually pretty simple when you boil it down. We have to take collective action. And Scotland's certainly willing to play her part.
First Minister, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for your time.
So the First Minister there clearly and unsurprisingly very critical of the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and his decision, his announcement today saying that he has abdicated political responsibility. I should add that here at the UN, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres was critical of all rich and developing countries that he says have not done enough. And just one more note, he called on all of them to end fossil fuel subsidies, saying the following, quote, "The naked greed of entrenched interests are raking in billions from fossil fuels."
All right, Sumi, thank you very much for getting us all those updates from New York.